Have you enjoyed the passing moment a little more now that there is something further to work to dissect? And I read David Foster Wallace's This Is Water this last week. I've recently been so thoughtful of his impact and what might have been exactly the inner workings of his thought space. And I think that it's important to realize that there is a sum total, and it always follows in a circle of life. And I'm going to get to that. In regards for the political games that our country is playing right now, I want there to be a consideration that the snake will eat its tail. I've had a moment in a private conversation where I immediately caught on to this sense that that ancient emblem and its meaning is something that we are absolutely, infinitely brought under to so consider exactly our truest nature. Thinking back to that previous point where I said it's getting online in the process of realizing that you are consuming the product and you are the product. An appendix to that point that might help is that you are the receiver of the world that you create. That membranic, I don't know if it's a membranic, but maybe it is out of some sort of membrane that we interact with a giving and a taking at once, and you are the manifestation of what you also seek to give out and inevitably will take in. Dialing in, once again, this week's hot take, I wanted to claim that right now we're watching a political game where there is a sense of a winner and a loser far beyond what is purposeful. And I've said it before, the Donald Trump for a third term is something that might break this mold. That although initially the George Washington empowered stance on the 2 terms limit, and without the quote, I hope you can just give yourself the moment to where you know you've imagined what that must have been like for the first president of the United States to decide. And the vitally honorable exercise that is involved as a point of thought to, again, create that future opportunity. I think to some fact, along with also many others, that we live in an entirely different age right now, that it might be better to stop this snapping back on one party or the other, as so much of what one party does these days is in an air of misunderstood response to the attacks of the other party. So I think in hearing some of the recent points made by Republican commentators that different aid for children, the child tax credit of $1,000, and some of these things with the Make America Healthy Again aspects that truly make me think that the party scheme of one versus the other is run by this deep state creature that I likened to this, creature of the Neverfold that both consequently hates itself and wants itself to disappear, but also understands that it has to make that next move, and the prayerful circumstance that I hope they do fall under for as serious of actions they must carry out, I hope one might gain a greater appreciation for. But the fact that the Republican side of things almost get to feel kind of like the party that is doing more like the intelligently right thing these days is a very, very important thing to address, I think, what was largely a cause of Donald Trump's rise to power. And those on the left need to acknowledge the bigger picture. And I hope I can get a little bit more into ways in which we can start thinking about that. I'd like to thank every idea that I've not wanted this episode. And whenever I say thanks, I try and think about that next level of what thanks must maybe kind of do. And what I mean by that is not thinking about it as this command that we take on to express a gratitude, but more as an active giving of thank. And if you've heard into ancient mythology and Sumerian cultures that reference the Ankh, whenever I do say thanks, I'm highly likely to think about exactly how I am breathing that metaphysical complex of what I think an Ankh might have allowed those depicted individuals. The Ankh is the cross with a loop on the top. Kind of a capital T hung by a lanyard or like a piece of thread. Glossary. What began as a play on the word thought, with a T missing at the end, thos, and then with insight jumped to glossary. Bridge the gap into an available comparison with glossary, and finding the root of that word to be glossa, with the meaning of tongue, it invites one to think that thosa might be seen as the mind's tongue, the area of the brain that articulates the motion of an ideological center in our common understanding of the world in which we live. I seek to explore the current occurrency of normal typicality within our mental modes of cognition. I've recorded sound bites to the sound effects of various frequent happenings that I believe will most help a shaping of advance into further parts of speech by looking at where those words of ours start, the events of change that give us pause. I will use those effects in effect to build each weekly episode onto a based segmentation of what comes to inspire best a partition of the week's news and considerable perspective writings that with every prayerful sighting might bring an evolved ability to adorn our expressions of the language in use with greater fluidity and meaning and complexity toward progression. So, with each episode building a more developed approach and ultimately a larger sequencing of our communication, I will examine the bigger points of view and present a glossary of thinking that, with diligence, aligns missing pieces to the puzzle that is society's confusing mix of histories in a form that I think helps put edge to edge and befitting in many flexibilities, gives access to deeper purposing when it seems most impossible at present to see music in the messy with any clarity. Glossary. Episode 3. Lucklier Query. As this week has resolved from last week's episode, I spent the time working to bring balance to my awarenesses, and I actually was talking with somebody else about an interesting last name when I thought of the word Lucklier. And out of its insight and its non-relevant inspiration, I think that it needs to be broken down as an adjective adverb. It's an of the luckily without the I. A lot of times it's much more accepted to have luckily an I in between luck and ly, though that energy, that luckily indication towards the evidentially relevant luckifier is hopefully building this idea of Lucklier as something that increases being luckily. And luck is something that is very ancient, with its try your luck and gambling being something that is certainly a human fantasy. Maybe it is a human fantasy, but it is a human also favorite. It's luckily a, again, religiously opposed type of construct, but I seek to bring it into something that can keep its presence underneath the umbrella of what we might not shire our awareness or our sense of application from. Query, I think of it as the active, somewhat question, right? It has that same QUE beginning to it, but instead of a quest, it's a query with an RY at the end. So it has a little bit more of a hypothetical and an unformulated point of its meaning. So the Lucklier query, in my impression here, stands to describe something that always improving and redefining workaround of what is truly more objective. Because I still think with this Lucklier, I'm saying that there is an aspect that is all on our principles of chance that brings us into the places that I believe will only continue to foster a relationship with what it means to be lucky. And with the questions of whether or not we frankly, revealably, ask for luck again. The point to start on with this, for me, was the visions of the fearful possibility. So I was on my motorcycle a week or so ago, and I pulled up to this stoplight before a freeway on-ramp, and there was traffic crossing the diagonal from the other off-ramp to my right. And I had those pre-ride check paranoias run through my mind. It's like, okay, well, if my brake didn't work right there and I go flying through some of that traffic coming the opposite direction, is there a chance that I could dodge left, dodge right, and maybe avoid hitting a car coming the other direction as fast as it was? That is really the base point of this kind of thought. And I've spent a lot of time considering on my motorcycle, I think is a good example, whether or not I was ready for a bump in the road. And, well, could I trick myself to say, oh, well, there's something, move to the right or left? And, I've always found that I believe that it's not in one's best interest to try and sense that there's a realistic threat when there is none. But in those visions, and as again the first point, I thought, okay, what am I really getting at right now with this title and this feeling to refine my thoughts into a better next frame of this experience that I have. And in those visions, I believe that we are commending a moment of our efforts into something that is exactly tied to, I think, where we seek out a degree of lawless fullness, lawfulness. At its point is Much like the previous episode, I think something that can derive a false power in our best interest, and that next level of our being in tune with the law is to understand a next degree of our lawfulness. And in my personal experience, I've found that the testing of where I exist relative to a law is something that brings me about into Lucklier query. As if luck could only be something that is somehow seen as breaking a physical lawfulness, I might leave you to consider. Otherwise, luck. But the encompassing point of living in such a way that we are developing a deeper trust with our questionable luck. It pops in my head a quote that I've heard on the Christian radio. A faith that cannot be tested is a faith that cannot be trusted. And I have a subtle, disarming thought to that, even as to how much is it founded in still an air of something waiting to be discovered. But I think you probably can really catch into this sense that luck is something that we spend the lifetime we have trying to try, again, that try your luck. And the tapping, the total point, the total attempt, right? Altogether, life is trying. And in listening to old Bible verses on a run yesterday, and particularly the plagues of Egypt that Moses embarked his progression against the Egypts, that in the altogether representation of the universe, I wanted to try my disarming a harmony of my own ideas to what was occurring at that time in history as something that is absolutely God, but in its scientific breakdown, I was thinking that, okay, well, maybe this is what's occurring, and the Egyptians lived for many, many thousands of years. Their dynasties are in the realm of the thousands, and I am relatively sure that 6,000 to 8,000 years is a general good estimate for how long the Egyptian empire was building and crashing upon itself. But then in all the existence and possibility of there being slaves in earlier human history, and what representatively cut my run short, because as I heard about the Exodus out of Egypt and put my faith into it, I watched my strength return towards reverence that made me just want to appreciate the passing day and the sunshine and the expression of life around me, and how much I felt that if there was any hope in observing and giving credence towards the happenings of those chapters, that I would be giving it in the total point of knowing that in connection with God there is the truth, and there is the factual finding of where life is the way. I would like to bring this back in towards the political realm, and again, a horror movie that brings about a great title for what I think needs to be more digestible for us in the deciding and reconstituting of what we think the U.S. government ought to be enacting with its policy. The movie The Devil Made Me Do It. And it took me a moment and actually a reading of a leftist perspective on the One Big Beautiful Bill. And this movie hearkening is, I've pondered on a general relevance and extruding kind of quality that what I thought about this movie off of was the fact that the government made me do this. And from a first-hand perspective, most recently at a job type, it was particularly a role that I played for about 2 months at my company. And in the course of that role, I experienced a moment where all of a sudden I was asked to do the level of work that before I was doing out of my own goodwill. And I wasn't given any warning, and on my shift that day, as much as I was putting every ounce of my effort and my energy and my epitome, my total identity, as soon as I had that loss of what was my going above and beyond, I was taken aback and I went into a degree of shock, because all of a sudden what I was doing was no longer out of the good me. It was out of a demanded and decided beyond my willpower and my consistency to, at its dire state of offensiveness, was something that sought to scoop out and implant a part of what was me with what was something that was just the company. And as I think about the ways to disarm the different perspectives that each side has, faithfully and with intention, I do try to break down the issues in ways that more or less feels like standing in the middle of two demanding opponents that seek to bring their best challenges with the key pacifier of the woes to the policies that are supposedly cutting taxes for the rich that are already paying years' salaries of me every year, and what it might mean for that money to be going towards what under God is going to be plagued and seen by all being to be a hardening of hearts against our loves and our trusting, growing, inviting, and peace of life working together to be whole, holy. I think it's unfortunately forgot upon what is a perspective that maybe just also needs to be there, because it is exactly the progression and the passing on of lesson to hear a lot of what we do here. But Lucklier query and what is so the devil made me do it is a whole other thing entirely. And so I hope those that observed my notes in the past day that were considering what has the devil made me do it with this sense of Lucklier query and what is in this near possibility of danger or lawful disregard. I think you're probably happy to know that it does relate more towards this political kind of rehash on what freeing up the individual willpowers of what are almost debatably the smartest and most well capable individuals of our society. Although they have been the Pharaoh, they have very much drawn about slavery of the constituency. I think as we learn to continue the developments that I think really hit a maybe enzymatic catalyst, and hashtag enzymatic is just rebringing of what enzyme is, that the coming age right now is one that we might all realize how much we were being shredded by different technology's ability to disregard a higher power. And as far as the Republicans just being the head of the snake or the tail that of that snail eating its take of its snake, I hope in the next couple sections we see that we need to redefine what this winning is and continue to act with our sidedness as, frankly, upon observations of our karmic justitudes in relevance to being a worldly connected entity, that I believe we each all need so much of our own challenges and our heartaches in these differences in order to continue to upbring the connection of our industry and our unsaid bond and love for people from third world countries. And I had a poem that said the line, "Besides, keep." And in the nugget of my understanding, it was to say left, right. Keep. Stay where there is not the leak. And that as much as that would be what you would want, there needs to be a different way forward. Can we do it? Lucklier query? Are we truly enacting a deeper ability to construct luck as we learn to test and trust it? Can we do it? Can Republicans pull out all the stops? As a fantastic statement that the stops. Every time someone within their congressional gusto wants to bring about something that is so hindering to progression and our sense to believe that government will ever be so fluid again, on what I saw today as we need to bring back the village mentality. And in every instance of the moments of confusion and misunderstanding, can we trust the underlying sense of what? Maybe not luck, but as far as this constructed thought that might be a sweep or a drop or a hum or a click, Lucklier query. Does there need to be a moment in which we ask for that luck? And if so, what is its impact on that around us if we weren't already well positioned to receive a luck. I think that in my work to become endowed on the connective front with that which is unpredictable, I have a great sense to understand upon what I've justified is my own body's atemporality, the holding of my body's breath, and the loss of a presence that was not done away without a gain of something else. That there is a predictive power towards what occurs. And frankly, for me, in the working of that, I certainly have a Lucklier query call, a motion that, in my belief that I'm doing what is in the highest good, as I do every next right, that I can go and I can ask for the presence to have the belief that I am in just time and happening. And I don't know what entirely sharing that will do at this point, but maybe it will bring upon a clarity for that which I feel like I might have used and gone over by this point as something that proved to me a deeper reality, but in terms of its coming and going, so much to be said about other things that I maybe have lost on account of not knowing how well I share it. And in the change to express that kind of reality more and more clearly and again, maybe it brings about a more tangible and macroscopic sense of the Lucklier query. And again, a lot of luck in a gambling sense, as it has been a fascination. That was the word I was thinking about for earlier. The fascination that we have with luck has tended to the waters of less divine allowance, maybe. The allowance of the divine is something that with luck we might claim is something that leaves one feeling more responsible. And upon the echoing of those ideas, I think we can see something mighty in what maybe Lucklier query directs us in knowing that it is a divine practice, and we should be testing of the lawfulness in ways that represents that testing as something that reasonably is a very common way in which we try and define a confirmed luckiness. And query, I think, isn't that just a nice sounding word for what we're meaning here? It's not a questioning, it's just a query, and it's sort of has this ear as much as Lucklier also does too. So it's kind of like these two ears with these commodifying luck and lucka. That's quite enough. Democrats haven't lost. Where in Republicans pulling out all those stops can they see towards a common gain? And as we consider what, aside from what is so thrown around and out of its clarity and those necessary keys to unlock some of what these well-founded ideologies and very well supported and believed angles on our country's policy and governance. Again, what keeps those keys out of the media other than knowing that there still needs to be the formulation of, I don't want to say our Lucklier queries as much as what, anytime you have something a little bit new, you kind of want to test it there. With Make America Healthy Again as the one that I like to have confidence and faith that anybody is understandably happy about, as much as we all need to denounce and develop our oppositions towards things like, oh, well, I wanted to be the person that saved the day. It's like, oh, we should be happy that the day is being saved. And some of the economic gains that, again, I think just need that key that if the government makes you do it, there's a loss there. And it might not even be in the most well-rounded position or the most well-rounded function if it's given to some government body that decides because of some statistical realm that might be so much better off in the hands of somebody that is knowingly doing something that both allows them to feel like more kind and generous individuals that in the long run tack that in, it is a butterfly effect and brings about so much of the positive embodiment that might be robbed from the government and robbed and taken and seen as something that is actually, all those people with money that want this or that actually doing maybe the wrong thing. So then there's even this further sway back over what line I'd say is in a state of equilibrium, that is the news outlets and those that think that this is a power and money grab going on that puts those people in a deeper state of fight. And as for where to go next and whether to bring about the fact that it's a good thing, I think, that kids growing up today more or less realize that, yes, there is sometimes a consequence and a violently deadly, morbid consequence to the way that we grow up. So much that when I think about Sandy Hook being a false flag, or, a false flag and maybe not, a fake incident, something that isn't real, something that kids didn't have to die for, but realistically were evacuated, or the many others that, are tragedies, that if there was consequently something seen as so good about, kids realizing that, their classmate that's really down and not doing so well, like, might show up and kill other students, how much does that actually influence every student to be kinder and to be more prepared and to cherish life more? I mean, it's that kind of perspective that is really a tough one to say is anything but just very built on a matter-of-fact standpoint and looking at the positive. And, well, frankly, I can't even remember the name of that school in Texas that the police officers stood outside and didn't go and infiltrate the situation to stop the attacker right away. It's like, gosh, well, can we maybe just take a moment and think about how struck with fear I'm saying like an extraterrestrial kind of way they could have been, how much the FBI was already definitely showing up, or whatever kind of secret operation was occurring was something that absolutely was swept under the rug, I don't know. I mean, that immediately for me leads into some aspect of celebrity crime and how much I have a tendency to want to go, well, I'm not sure if they really did that. Because, well, I guess I don't think I necessarily need to feel like I'm so offended by what happened and in the immediacy of it, and how much I think it aligns to a sense of, well, everybody is innocent upon a religiously founded following of Jesus Christ, maybe, that their sins are paid for, and we shouldn't necessarily but continue to hold on to our piousness and trust that within the judicial scene that they do receive what they so need to, but to practice that immediate forgiveness is maybe, I think, what I'm saying that I do so realistically. And in extending to the LGBTQ plus realm of what I believe is all still very well tied into this train of thought, that there needs to be an understanding that there are these places that we go and we visit, and it's purposeful in the development of everything that we're so at this membranic speaking with, God, or so be it the place in which we know we find life. And it's a difficult position to know that there is a impossibility in having everything come and work itself out in ways that we can understand in a lifetime. And we need to continue to try and understand what's going on. But right now, it revolves around Lucklier query is not what I think. But as I hope with these sections, the development and the presentation of these ideas are not but different sides to what I'm hopefully all aiming for. So with where in which do you understand that your better lucks were occurring, there's an incentive in finding the miracle, and what things take you away from or out of, and with purpose maybe discordantly in the necessary ways to reframe, but to frame. And the trust in that is something that I think non-negotiably, I didn't like using that word in the first episode because, well, where is there a negotiation? But maybe now is where I get to make its connective perfection in throwing it back around with these kind of thoughts. Is the negotiation, is it a negative or I don't think it can be so much of the the goshi. Piling on with every next decisive action that's made, there's something either created or destroyed. And I think about piling, and I'm just such a word nut that I actually think about piling on more before I can make sense of why it was something that popped in my head in the first part. And maybe somebody else would have thought piling on or piling, and maybe they would have piley. It's a little bit piley. I don't know, exactly where all of the different thoughts and ideas come about in the speaking of this, in the beforehandedness, in the priory space of this is creation. But I most wanted to get to the fact that as we are continuing to so pile on more and more of the necessary advance and rehabilitation of thought, the repurposed, the recycled, the reused points of view, and somehow watch all of the old ones, the old expertise of where they were initially, reaching through this pile of a thought like a collapsing of a speed cup tower, that slides down. I'm thinking of a game in which there is all of a sudden the cascading effect of where in the bigger picture those efforts to bring an oppositional approach of one's own interests, again, towards something that should have already been solved and learned upon. I'm seeing through that pile as I step through and into it. As much as I bring the focus to bring centeredness to everything in my life, I believe in that moment I saw that there's every good, faithful, and honestly trusting person doing exactly what they need to in that moment. And I need to leave a little bit of a note that I know right now I'm shaving down the aspects of my thought that I don't necessarily realize I am bringing into their forms, their best, the hopeful, the faithful, the trusting, the ordered, the each of these words that I'm saying beyond, I think, their needed points, like my ums, the words that, like and in also its school of being well formulaic with your speech to avoid the use of like that is way too much to be going on right now. They're these words that I know I'm trying to gain an appreciation for a more subconscious existence. And what an alarm really does is a simple thing, but it really means so much. And I'm reaching into that with a knowledge that this section has come about as, I think, very much an artistically flowing and roller coastered put together amalgam of an idea that I really didn't have a lot to say about at the beginning, piling on, and with the noted pi, 3.14, etc. And yeah, so there's a cool part about this that shows in transcendental sense. I don't know, I probably couldn't keep going on in the calculation of my spot right now to be speaking to you. There's a significance of this point that needs to be cut right about now, but piling on, let's keep pile, and there's a little bit of an aisle, a p-aisle, a pile, a piling. Piles are typically round if there's just the random motion to continue building a pile the way that it falls off. So maybe there's a word or origin there that was not as understood in its creation. I wonder. Its creation of word to the concept of a pile, I'm saying. So I'm walking around this old building, and it's a big building. I'm on maybe the 6th or 7th floor. And the way the floor was creaking, I absolutely needed to realize how much I was walking around with this energy of the building. I was walking around like the building might come down upon my walking. And it was a very unique feeling for me because it made me, as I said, incorporate the size of this building into each one of my steps. And the graceful and the tender and the careful, each step that I had was with something bigger in mind, and it was magnificent. And I don't know if you'll have the opportunity to have the feeling that I did in the near future, but I hope you can imagine that for a moment and extend its potential application towards the ways in which that we are walking around on a massive scale of our successes and failures. And if we were to think about how stressed and how weakened maybe, or how under the magnificence of, under the sheer size of it, there has to be major points of force and points of this building that are barely holding up, but they are. And as anybody who could extend that idea in that applicable manner, to think about this whole world as this massive building that we're building up. Tread lightly. And I hope I know I hear the sensed effect that might be there, and it's about time for the final section, I think. Alright, time for what I'd like to say is going to be my favorite section. It's the card shuffle. I'm gonna hit the shuffle button and see what we got. Annecy, France. You might have heard about it. This one came about in a way that those thoughts that you didn't want come about, and I thought the first thing, annex. Annecy, annex. And as we work amongst our annexations, I think annecy is maybe a sort of supporting point to what annex is. And that CY at the end over the X, maybe there's a reason to say that it's smoother and it functions around what is a little more reasonable, as opposed to the X is really hard and something. God damn it. You can't get so mad at them. Especially when they're just trying to spend some time with you. But I just don't want you to hear that jingle jangle. Okay, we're back. Tough. Next point. Next card. Two-tiered justice. I heard this concept and it really struck home with me. It's the sense that different people have different outcomes depending on their existing characteristics. And I thought it could maybe even be something that was more positively thought about, that having two tiers to our justice system is an important, maybe, realignment of what we think about our punishments and like the penalties and our breaking of the law. And it immediately rings a bell in the direction I was heading with the tests of our lawfulness. I think that we need to exist outside the law for these times when we're in adjusting to it. And if there was the tier that was more serious crimes like the felonies, maybe we could have another tier that was more like the misdemeanors. And so with the infractions, where are our fractions? Next, riding lightning. Lightning, Jacob's ladders its ways down to the ground, and in riding that lightning, there's an understanding that in each next kink, in each next path, as it's seeking its ground, if you were to ride that lightning, it wouldn't be like traveling along the path of a photon. So famously for the Einstein's relativity clausing. But what might be happening if you were to really ride that lightning down? Next, Brunt Didi Dok. This one was wanting to build off the brunt of the joke common saying, but with what's said here, I think I want you to think of how of the turned into DD, of D in Spanish and Latin, other sensed origins, is of. So the Jamaican almost sounding brunt did a joke, did a doke, is holding true, I think, cross-culturally, in a way that was possibly because of the French presence in the Caribbean and the Spanish as well, of course. But doc and D as in D. I don't know exactly where I was totally going with that, but the doke and the joke and the okie doke. And there's only so saying that doke has okay in it already. But we love okie doke. We love okie doke. Centralized bank. In thinking about future finance, I was inspired to think, as our dollars exist, they've so been printed for the time of our fiat currencies, and they are somewhat trackable. They have their serial numbers, but I think huge, major advance in statistical working in the future is going to be as we can track the creation of those dollars into their wealths. And I'm really excited about the prospect of knowing that, okay, these dollars were created because of this industry. And I hope we can have access to appreciate a little bit more about the actual picture of how that is being circulated in our community, and that it's of all of our best spending and earning to be able to, I mean, maybe even like legitimately pull up at any time the statistics on where our dollars came from, and that there can be within that knowing the peaceful tiding of our greater looking up and knowing that, okay, yeah, like we ought to be really thankful for that, and that it'll also allow the economics of our industries to really dial in the discrepancies between those industries and identify with fuller confidence how much wealth is distributed in its actual valueness. New thoughts. This was a overarching picture to the podcast here, that is there new thoughts? When am I gonna catch glimpse of the first thought as I'm thinking about it in here? And within a neural link kind of regression of our neural activity, brain activity, there's a sense to say, okay, well, we can define this as being this intended action. And so supposedly there is regression, the parsing of that activity that can be made by those with the right level of transducers. But I'm hoping to think about this as something that is a little bit more constructive. And are all of our thoughts remelding of what is already there? Have we only been so trusting of a deeper, godlike, intentionally operating point of view that does allow us to communicate and share different ideas that are confirmed and given their altruistic point of their godliness, and we're just waiting to organize our thought forms, our thought sounds, to clearer and more defined, okay, that was exactly that thought. And as much as you hear another language, and a lot of times without knowing the words, especially in their fluencies, you can't tell where one word starts and the other word begins. And so it would be impossible to learn that language without knowing that you're starting from the base forms. Ketone. And ketones in the body are the fat cells that are broken down for energy when there is lesser glucose. And very key in the diabetes world, because ketoacidosis is what occurs when there is not the adequate amount of breakdown of those ketones. And I thought it was interesting to apply towards the E and the tone as ke tone, as well as the ketone, like a lock and key. E, the capital E, for me, in relevance to the lowercase e being something that carries the natural log function and phi so encoded in its complex expression, e to the I pi, and how cosine and sine are developed out of it. Just in the same, the real nitty-gritty of physics as a letter. I say tongue-in-cheek because it is just a letter. Again, but also speaking to bring that together, the capital E for me has really represented kind of the time travel symbol. And if you think about the capital E having the 3 prongs, and maybe also you think about the F being one that is lacking the bottom, that a F and L could make a capital E if you were to superimpose them. But E for me, if you were to think about the 3 and what they might mean, maybe you would think of the past, present, and the future. Or maybe you'd think of the ground level, the inner spurious mixing of then the top level, which is so in thin air. Thin air. E as this ka-E tone. Is it the tone of a K that represents somewhat of a diffraction with I have an apostrophe in between the lowercase k, an apostrophe, and then a capital E before the dash tone. And well, is that the key? And we're thinking about ketones in our body, the fat cells that are broken down when we don't have the glucose. Our time travels, our lack of presence that we gain as we lose the in-touchness of our physical operating. All put together, I think those words really I don't know, ketone. Next one is the F-15 test pilot that I saw getting after Top Gun Maverick about the test scene where he takes the speed of his aircraft past what was the designated limit that day, and he ejects at Mach 10, and that's a mile every 0.6 seconds. I was surprised that he was able to pull that out so fast, as maybe not knowing of Mach 10 that well, but digressed. The offensiveness that it caused this pilot made me intrigued, and he said that as he was watching the movie, he was laughing in theaters, and his wife was telling him to be quiet. But in the humor of it, and what I found to be so valuable about that movie, I think there is a little bit of the same thing. And I haven't gone back to this idea of like the Lucklier query, but maybe it's a really personal kind of thing. Lastly, ifism. And so I'm saying this is like a suffix of a word that might end with a ifism. And this one, I can only tell you, is one that was reputably founded in knowing that some words are surprise-isms, I'll say. And some words certainly don't need to act as ifisms. But in the ists and the dangers we have with things about racists and the ists, there is another side to them. And the ifisms, maybe that's actually somewhere where we need to be thankful about our Lucklier queries into the dangerous, so almost lawless fullnesses that help us realize that luck is a real thing. And chasing luck testing it is in our divine interests, but only in the ways that we can say we're all about us. And that's been this week's episode. Thank you for tuning in, and might you have all the next best thoughts, as if it was all in your best luck to be here, and so considerably.